Hello class. Today we're going to be learning about the second line of defense. So we learned about the first line of defense, those general barriers to entry, the chemical agents within our saliva, within our tears that kill bacteria, our stomach acid, our ciliary escalator within our respiratory tract and our skin. And today we are going to explore the different components of the innate immune system. So it's the innate or non-specific defense mechanisms that our body has. Now, when I say non-specific, this means that it does not target any specific pathogen. This will target any foreign antigen that enters your body. Now, what are they? Well, we have white blood cells, macrophages, and neutrophils. Keep in mind, neutrophils are phagocytic, just like your macrophages, but they are in very high numbers. That's that army of white blood cells I talked about hanging out in your blood that get called to action when there is, say, tissue damage or infection somewhere in the body. What else is there? Well, there's inflammation. Inflammation is extremely important. It allows those cells to get to where they need to go. However, it's a double-edged sword. I'm sure that you've sprained something before. What happens, right? Well, often you have to do the RICE method. RICE is rest, ice, compress, elevate. Now, there's also fever and interferons, both of which are very important as well. And fever, again, is a double-edged sword. All right, so white blood cells. We have macrophages. These are large phagocytic cells. They engulf foreign particles, and they will often present little snippets of those particles on their surface to activate our third line of defense, which will be the focus of our next lesson. Neutrophils are, again, the most abundant white blood cell. And this is that army that hangs out in your blood that can get called into action. So once these foreign particles are engulfed, phagocytes break down these foreign particles in lysozymes. So if you remember the first unit we did, we talked about those different cellular organelles, lysosomes being one of them. Do not confuse lysozyme like I just did with lysosomes. Because lysosomes are organelles that contain a whole slew of digestive enzymes to break things down, whereas lysozyme is a chemical agent which destroys the bacterial cell wall, and that's found in your saliva and your tears. So, if you're wondering what this picture is here, we have two different solutions that were both inoculated with bacteria. And in this one here, you see it's completely clear there's no growth because it contains lysozyme, whereas in the control here, we did see growth. So do not confuse those two. Our inflammatory response. So it is triggered whenever the body tissues are injured. So let's say you step on a rusty nail, or you stub your toe, or whatever it may be, you will get the inflammatory response happening. Now, what's going to happen is you're going to release histamines as a result of this damage, and this is going to start the inflammatory response. Now, you know some of the things that happen, right? Let's say you get a cut on your arm. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? Think about it. Well, generally, besides the blood, the area will get red, it will get swollen, it will get hot, and let's talk about why that happens. So histamines are produced from basophils and mast cells, and this generally causes redness, swelling, heat, and pain. Now, unfortunately, like a lot of our immune system, sometimes your body has this reaction against things that are harmless. Myself, for example, I suffer from seasonal allergies. I get very bad hay fever. I have allergies to dust and mold because my basophils are releasing histamines in response to these harmless antigens, which is a big issue for myself because then I get swelling, redness, edema, fluid leakage within my nasal cavity. It's just very uncomfortable. So, what does this histamines cause? Well, it causes your classical symptoms of inflammation. And what are your classical symptoms? That's going to be redness, swelling, heat, and pain. These are the things associated with inflammation. Now, for my allergies, right now, I'm breathing clearly. That's because I took an antihistamine, a class of drugs that blocks the effect of these histamines. Now, what are the main events? Well, vasodilation is a really big one. So, if you injure an area, your blood vessels are going to dilate in that area, and as a result, you will have fluid leaking out of your blood vessels. Remember, your capillaries, are they really thin? Are they really thick? Do you remember? Right, they're one cell thick. So if they dilate, it makes it a lot easier for fluids to leak out. And as well, it allows those neutrophils to squeeze through the gaps within those cells and enter that infected area or that damaged area. So vasodilation is why you get a lot of those symptoms, right? Vasodilation, more blood flow to the area, that's going to make it hotter. Fluids leaking out, that's going to cause it to swell. You're going to get redness as a result as well. So those signs of inflammation are due to vasodilation. Now, again, I said the dilated capillaries increase permeability. Again, as you dilate, those cells are going to kind of, I guess you could say, stretch, right? The gaps between them become more passable, both for neutrophils as well as fluids, and you get a lot of leakage as a result. Fever. Fever is an interesting one. Why is it that we get fevers? I'm going to link a video below. It may seem like it's completely irrelevant, but it has everything to do with fever. It's the defense mechanism that Japanese honeybees use against Asian giant hornets. I'm not sure if you know about the Asian giant hornets versus Japanese honeybees, but 30, 40 Asian giant hornets could take out an entire colony of tens of thousands of honeybees, for sure, right? They are ferocious in their ability to kill those honeybees. The honeybees have developed an adaptation to kill scouting Asian giant hornets. Watch the video below, it is quite remarkable. Now, our body does effectively the same thing as the honeybees. Right? Our body will raise our temperature to kill off, to heat kill that infection. Right? So the whole purpose of a fever, because remember when we studied enzymes and enzyme function, enzymes have that range in which they work optimally. You get too hot and those enzymes will denature. All organisms have a temperature range in which they function best. Go outside of that and they could die. So when we get a fever, it's our body increasing the thermostat to try to kill off that foreign invader. So how does it work? Well, pyrogens, a class of chemical compounds, is released from macrophages. They reach the hypothalamus, and remember the hypothalamus is the thermostat of your body. And as a result, your temperature will rise. So viruses. They enter the body cells, they hijack organelles, and they turn the cell into a virus-making facility. Now, viruses, although technically not qualified as living, they are one of the most dominant things on our planet. There is immense amounts of viruses that infect all types of life, right? We're actually running out of viable antibiotics due to antibiotic resistance, so we're starting to actually explore now viruses that kill bacteria as a way of fighting them. Now, viruses are scary because our body doesn't have the same set of defense mechanisms against them. We're going to learn a little bit more as we get into viruses about how our cell-mediated immune response works, but unlike bacteria where we have antibiotics, there isn't the same analog or the same thing for viruses. Now, viruses are very effective at reproducing, but they do require living cells to reproduce. They invade the cell, they hijack its reproduction machinery, and they turn it into a virus production facility, at which point they will either cause the cell to burst and release virus into the surrounding environment, or they bud out of the plasma membrane and they're enveloped within effectively a little membrane. The current strain of coronavirus going around is an enveloped virus. That's partly why soap is so effective against it, right? Washing your hands well with soap is one of the best ways to ensure you kill off that coronavirus. Because what did we learn about membranes? Right? They're amphipathic in nature. Soap, also amphipathic in nature. Soap can disrupt the coat around the coronavirus and effectively make it so it cannot infect your cells. So soap is very effective against coronavirus. Now, what does our body have to fight this? So one part of our second line of defense is interferons. Interferons, just as they sound, they interfere with the virus's ability to get into your cells. Now, this here is probably not the best example that I'm showing right here. This is a bacteriophage. It's a bacteria virus. Now, they recognize a very specific chemical marker on the surface of the bacteria. And once it recognizes it, it will bind and it will inject its genetic material. Viruses against us work the same way, right? They recognize some chemical signal on our cells, and then they will bind and inject their genetic material. Well, if we can take that part of the virus that binds to our cells and we put stuff on it, well, now it can't recognize anything. And that's kind of what interferons do. They interfere with the virus's ability to infect our cells. Now, a big question here is what happens to already infected cells? So let's say that virus gets past our first line of defense, right? It gets past our second line of defense, and now it's injected its genetic material into our cells. What does our body do next? Well, that is going to be the next lesson. Our third line of defense jumps in. But before we go into the third line of defense, let's talk about, very briefly, antigens versus antibodies yet again. You should have a basic understanding from blood, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail here. Antigens are substances that initiate the third line of defense and causes your immune system to produce antibodies. This can be any foreign substance from the environment. So in essence, an antigen is something your immune system can recognize. Right? That's all it is. It's something your immune system can recognize. Now, some antigens, for example, antigens found on your own cells, we treat those as self, right? We treat them as harmless. We do not form immune responses against those. At least we hope that you do not form those against them. But foreign antigens, say bacterial proteins or viral proteins, things like that, our body can recognize, and then we can initiate that third line of defense to produce things to fight against it. So that is all for today. We are going to explore the third line of defense in a lot of detail, and a big part of it is understanding that antigens are just things our immune system can recognize, and antibodies are what bind to antigens, right? Antibodies have a site that can bind to that antigen. Okay, that's all. Have a wonderful day.